morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Clean Lakes Alliance's Yahara Lakes 101 Lake Science. I'm Courtney Searles from Johnson Financial Group and also a member of the Clean Lakes Alliance Finance Committee. Along with hosting sponsor the Edgewater, the University of Wisconsin Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, media partner the Isthmus, and supporting sponsor National Guardian Life Insurance Company, Johnson Financial Group, along with First Weber Foundation, is proud to be the presenting sponsor of the Yahara Lakes 101 Lake Science Cafe. Just a few quick announcements. First, I want to thank everyone who attended the Frozen Assets last month. Throughout the week, more than 10,000 people came to one of our events, which concluded with our large family-friendly festival. Second, believe it or not, our community breakfast is only 2 months away. James says buy tickets, buy them now, and you can buy them online through the Clean Lakes Alliance website. On Thursday, May 14th, we'll bring scientists, government officials, and local business leaders together to review our collective progress towards cleaner, healthier lakes. The event will again be held at the Alliant Energy Center, and tickets are on sale at cleanlakesalliance.org. So, a couple plugs for tickets. Finally, I'd like to recognize lake partners that either renewed or joined us last month. Their names are on the screen behind me. Lake partners make donations outside of events or sponsorships and help fund important lake improvement projects, educational programming like the Yahara Lakes 101, and citizen monitoring. Friends and lake partners receive many benefits, including free attendance to all Yahara Lakes 101 cafes all year long. And back to Yahara Lakes 101, today's talk is titled Planning for a Hotter, Wetter Wisconsin. Here to tell us a little bit more about today's topic, and our presenter is Elizabeth Kirstein from supporting sponsor National Guardian Life Insurance Company.
That's a great list of new partners that have come on board. It's exciting. Well, thank you, Courtney. Like Johnson Financial Group, National Guardian Life is proud to support these talks. Our building is right up the hill, and we look out over the lake, so it's an obvious and important relationship that we have with Clean Lakes. So we love to sponsor many of their events and help support them. And often we have one or two opportunities each year to have our employees spend some time volunteering on the lakes or in the parks. Today we're going to talk about climate change. Wisconsin, along with many other parts of the world, has experienced dramatic increases in the number of heavy rain events in recent years, as you all know. So how can we plan for a hotter and wetter future? Today, Dr. Daniel Wright of UW-Madison Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering will use the August 2018 flood to look at the challenges our watershed faces. He'll discuss technology to improve planning as well as areas of concern. A little bit about Dr. Wright. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Michigan and has a PhD from Princeton University, where he studied urban rainfall and flooding. He has worked with the World Bank, Peace Corps, and NASA, working on topics like flooding and landslide risks. Here at the University of Wisconsin, his research focuses on floods and how they are influenced by meteorology, urbanization, and climate change. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wright to the podium.
All right, is the microphone working? Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to come speak here, and thanks everyone for showing up and braving the both the coronavirus and early morning. I don't know which one of those is a little more scary than the other. So anyway, so we'll talk a little bit about thinking about where we are and where we're headed here in Wisconsin and Madison and maybe the region of the Midwest more broadly. A little bit just about ourselves before we get into that. So this is the Hydroclimate Extremes Research Group. The team, I don't know if I lead them or they lead me, but there they are. And we do a number of different sorts of research, but all of it somehow revolves around extreme rainfall and its consequences. So as was mentioned, things like floods and landslides. And so, we like to ask and try to find answers to questions like, why do these things happen, how often they happen, why they happen, and how they might be changing over time. And then something that I will touch on a little bit as well is that we do actually some software development, both to support our own research, but also to support others who are trying to do similar things as well. And so I'll touch on this a bit later on, but the main piece of software is this rainy day, which I'll show some results from later on in the talk. So just a sort of preview of what we'll be seeing today. And I apologize for all the sort of food metaphors up here. I don't know if I was very hungry when I was putting this presentation together or what the deal is. Hopefully everyone got something to eat. So we'll talk about different flavors of rainfall changes, and then from there move on to talk a little bit about why rainfall and flood, why floods are a little bit different from rainfall in terms of sort of how they happen and why. Including a couple of examples from our own research. So I will talk a little bit about August of 2018, but then also some other examples from throughout the region. And then from there, share a few of my ideas about things that we need to be thinking about. And then we'll wrap up and hopefully have plenty of time for some questions. So we'll start, as I mentioned, talking about different ways in which rainfall might be changing. And so I don't need to, I think, spend too much time convincing you that it is indeed changing. So this is showing in Madison yearly rainfall totals going up from 28 or so inches in the 40s up to almost 40 inches now. And so that's pretty dramatic change locally, but of course this is not unique to Madison or even to the upper Midwest, and so this headline is maybe 8 months or so out of date at this point, but still the story holds true that this has really been the wettest period in US history, and there's reason to think there's more to come in the future. So that's talking about sort of yearly scale precipitation. The same holds true when we're talking about extreme precipitation as well. So there's a lot going on in this slide, but basically what this is showing here is two different types of rainstorms. In the blue, the blue line is showing the trend in 10-year rainstorms, and the red line showing trends in 100-year rainstorms. I think for our purposes, we just need to recognize that 100-year storms are more severe, but less common than 10-year ones. The important point here is that the numbers of both of these types of events across the country are going up. Actually, I should be a little more careful when I say that. They're going up in the eastern US. They're not really going up, at least not nearly as dramatically in the western US. But since we live in the east, this is the sort of thing that we would be concerned about. And one thing that you'll note here actually is that if you look at the percent changes, it's actually those 100-year storms that are showing, 85% increase over this time period, whereas the 10-year storm is only showing about a 40% increase. And so, for some reason, the bigger storms are getting worse more quickly than the smaller ones. Okay, so both of these changes in both annual scale precipitation and extreme precipitation have a number of different consequences, and I'm sure you're familiar with many or all of these. So, for example, high lake levels, particularly on the Great Lakes, that are causing erosion issues, not entirely due to changes in precipitation, but certainly partially due to that. Issues related to algae blooms, of course, again, not entirely driven by changes in rainfall, but that is a big piece of it. And then 2019 was a tough year for farmers in the Midwest for all sorts of different reasons, but not the least of which was the flooding caused by all the extreme storms. And then lastly, we're seeing the emergence of some infectious diseases never before seen in this part of the country. And so you may already be familiar with this context, but if you're interested in finding out more about climate change issues of all sorts within Wisconsin, I would highly recommend that website there. They have a really nice collection of stories. So these are all things that are important. These are not things that I know all that much about. And so what I spend a lot more of my time these days thinking about are infrastructure implications, because I am a civil engineer. And so you, of course, don't have to look very far to see those sorts of issues throughout the state. Sort of damage to all sorts of different types of infrastructure related to extreme rainfall and floods. And the basic story as to why we're seeing these increases in extreme rainfall is shown here in this figure. So this is showing in graphical form what's called the Clausius-Clapeyron Equation, which is just describing the relationship between air temperature and what we're calling here vapor pressure, but really, if you like, you can think of this as humidity, right? So as the temperature goes up, and we can just look at the blue line, which is showing this for water, as the temperature goes up, the air can hold more water vapor, right? We know this because it's more humid in the summertime than in the wintertime, but as the climate warms, this is the humidity would be going up. So this is showing recent temperature change throughout the region, and we've seen an increase of about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 50 years or so. And so you certainly see these pinks and reds on this map of the upper Midwest, but one point that I'd like to make here is that we need to think bigger when we try to understand the relationships between warming and rainfall changes. And so we actually have to think about maps that are maybe more like this. And so here, looking at the whole US, we see more of these pinks and reds. And importantly, down around here, and in fact, we should really be even looking offshore, because particularly in the summertime, a lot of the moisture that ends up falling out in heavy rainstorms here is actually coming from the Gulf of Mexico, which is also warming up very, very quickly. And so, that humidity, water evaporates over the Gulf and makes its way up to where we are and falls out as rain. And so, I just wanted to make the point here that this is, you can't just think about what's going on locally if you really want to understand the nature of these sorts of issues. But I'm going to walk that back for a second, because there are local scale things that matter as well. And so this in particular we're talking about the urban heat island. So you may have heard of this before. The basic idea is that man-made surfaces, whether they be streets or buildings, are able to absorb and hold much more heat than natural surfaces, leading to higher temperatures in and around our cities as compared with the surrounding areas. And so that actually can lead to changes in rainfall. And so this is a paper from way back in my PhD and from a very different part of the country. So this gray blob here is the urban area of Charlotte, North Carolina. And in that part of the country, in the summertime, storms move from the southwest to the northeast. And so here we're looking at mean summertime rainfall. Here we're looking at, average summertime rainfall, average number of days with greater than an inch of rainfall. And in both of these maps, you see in and around, or I should say in and downwind of the city, increased rainfall relative to the surroundings. And so later on in the presentation, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to tie this back to how rainfall looks in Milwaukee, because there's some even more interesting things going on there in terms of the urban heat island. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about August of 2018. Some of you may have seen this figure before. It's made the rounds a little bit. I put this together in the couple of weeks after that storm, and what's going on here, hopefully you can see this clearly. So there are this blue shading here. What that is it's a map of rainfall from very high resolution weather radar observations. The other thing that we're showing here are these dots, which are rain gauges operated, essentially by weather enthusiasts around the area. So they might have a rain gauge out in their backyard. And there's a web-based system these days where these folks can then every morning go out, check how much water's in their rain gauge, go online and just report how much rain there was. And so, with these radar measurements, they're really nice because they give us this nice complete picture of rainfall over this whole area. So just to orient you, if this wasn't obvious already, there's Lake Mendota, Monona, and then this black line is the watershed, Yahara Watershed upstream of Lake Monona. So we get a nice complete picture of rainfall over the area, unlike the rain gauges that are just at individual locations. The problem with the radar is that it can be less accurate, and so what we end up doing is combining the two, essentially adjusting this radar up or down based on the rain gauge measurements, and at the end of the day we're left with a nice, very accurate and very detailed picture of where it rained and how hard it rained. And so, that's what happened. And you'll notice that a lot of the rain actually fell outside of the watershed to the west and southwest. And so, one of the things that I looked at was, well, what could have happened if that storm had occurred about 10 or 15 kilometers northeast of where it did? So what really happened was we got about 4.5 inches of rainfall over the watershed. If it had occurred here instead, shown in red, that would have been about 8 inches, so almost double what we actually got. And so for anyone who was around at that time, you can certainly imagine that getting almost double the rainfall that we saw would have been really pretty catastrophic. Okay, so what can we do with that sort of stuff? I mentioned this rainy day software already, and what that really does is it allows us to figure out how likely, it does a number of different things, but one of them is how likely things like the August 20th storm or the sort of worst case scenario shown here in red really could be. And so I'm going to walk you through what's going on here. So the x-axis is showing what we call return period, or the 100-year storm, for example, is right here. And then if you look up to this line and then look over, that's giving you the rainfall depth associated with that likelihood of occurrence. So the point here is we're going to actually reverse that. I said that we got 4.5 inches on August 20th over the upper Yahara. If you look down, that gives you something right around a 20-year storm. So that's certainly not something you'd expect to happen every day, but it's definitely within the realm of what engineers and planners have to worry about when it comes to infrastructure design and that sort of thing. So that worst case scenario, if the storm had hit directly over the watershed, so 8 inches, you look over, you look down, you get something north of a 200-year storm. And so, maybe there are different ways of thinking about this. In some sense, we dodged a bullet, but on the other hand, things could have easily been a whole lot worse than they were if basically the winds had been blowing in a slightly different direction than they were. And so we need to probably be thinking about those sorts of eventualities. So I'll take the moment to just say a little bit more, with this rainy day software, it's challenging, developing and maintaining your own piece of software, but it's kind of a fun process as well. And so we're working with a number of different groups who are using it. That includes City of Middleton has recently used this in some floodplain mapping that they've been doing for the Pheasant Branch. And then Madison and actually Dane County as well are currently not using our information directly, but as sort of motivation for some, and kind of ammunition, if you will, for some proposed stormwater ordinance changes. Beyond that, just recently started working with this One Concern Incorporated, which is a startup company out of Silicon Valley that's looking to use this software to do floodplain mapping for all of Japan, which is kind of an interesting challenge and a fun thing to work on with them. Okay, so if you'd like to find out some more details about that study, I mentioned WisContext already. This has been up there for a while now, but I do talk about some of these issues in a little more detail. Okay, so from there, let's get more into out of the rainfall and into the flooding. Although we're not going to certainly leave rainfall behind when we do that. So I've mentioned flood recipes, and what do I mean by that? Really the point here is that floods are never just one thing. They're made up of a number of different factors, and the key ingredients here would be rainfall for sure, but what that rain is falling on matters a lot. So if it's falling on a parking lot versus a prairie, the results are going to be quite different. And then the other thing here is say soil moisture. What I'm just saying there is how wet the soils were before that rain fell. So if it's been raining a lot over the last week or two, or whether it's been dry, is going to have a very big influence on how much of that water can soak in versus how much of it is going to become runoff and get into rivers and lakes quickly. And then on top of those key ingredients, depending on where and when you're looking, you could have other issues. So snowpack and snowmelt, certainly issues around here in the springtime, agricultural practices, high water levels, and then a variety of different types of infrastructure that could, depending on what infrastructure it is and how it's being managed, could make things better or worse when it comes to flooding. And so then, we've got all these different possible ingredients and spices, and so for any particular flood event, then you can maybe figure out what the different combinations were used in order to make up that recipe. And so, for example, I'd say this is probably where we were for August 20th. Though I would say that really, August 20th was probably more of a buffet line in terms of these recipes. And so this figure is just showing that there are, even when we're talking about flooding, there are different kinds of flooding that we can talk about. So up here we have what's called pluvial flooding. So This, particularly in an urban area, I would say is kind of that street level flooding, right? You have really intense rainfall. It might not even last for more than 15 or 30 minutes, but it just overwhelms the stormwater drainage systems and whatnot, and so you have flooding in intersections and things like that. So we certainly see that more often than we'd like in University Ave and some other places around town. Then fluvial flooding takes a little bit longer typically to take place, but that's your flooding along rivers. And then from there, coastal flooding, whether that's just the lakes around here or whether we're talking about, the coast of an ocean. And then we have groundwater flooding, where this is sort of, instead of flooding from above, it's essentially flooding from below, where the water table is rising up and up due to typically lots of rainfall over longer periods of time. And then, so, you could think about, we probably had all of these things during August of last year, just in Dane County. If you want to toss, northwest of here and, a week later into the mix, Baraboo and around there, certainly touched on all of these. And so that, means that really flooding around here can get quite complicated, I guess is the point. And, so the takeaway is that these recipes are going to depend a lot both on time, in terms of this sort of set of conditions that you're in at that particular moment, and the particular place where you are, right? Okay, so I want to show you two examples from our research that are not in Madison, but are not too far away either. And they're in some ways examples that are very different from each other, but in other ways have some similarities. So the first one is the Turkey River Watershed in northeastern Iowa. We do a lot of work there, and I'm going to show you some reasons why it's an interesting place to be doing flood research. So this is predominantly, well, really almost entirely agricultural. And it's a watershed that's showing some interesting changes from a hydrologic standpoint, although you wouldn't necessarily know it if you were to take the sort of look that hydrologists typically take. So this is showing, since about 1930, the largest single, we call it discharge, but so that's really saying river flow observation for each year since 1930. And this gray line, it might be a little hard to see, but this gray line is a trend line. And so the basic point here with this gray line is that actually there's apparently no trend in these largest river flow values. So you could say, well, there's no trend in flooding here in Turkey River. Well, you may say, well, yeah, that might be what the trend line says, but recently we've seen a couple of big ones that are bigger than anything in the earlier part of the record, so maybe something's going on. And so we looked a little more deeply to see what we could figure out. And so what we did here was took exactly the same data, but just labeled each of the data points up here according to when in the year that observation was taken. And so specifically in blue, we see springtime, so March and April floods, and then in red, we see the summertime, or late spring and summertime floods. And so what you get here is, instead of no trend, like we were seeing here, we actually see two trends going on. So there's springtime floods going down in magnitude, and the summertime floods going up in magnitude. Okay. So that's just summarizing that. The other important point here is that throughout Iowa, and I would say increasingly around here as well, the big floods do happen in May, June, and perhaps into July as well. And so the fact that we're seeing more of those is a bit problematic. So I mentioned this rainy day software already. I'm not going to go through in detail what this is showing here. The basic story is that, don't try this at home, I guess. So, this is the sort of thing that we do on supercomputers, we do on cloud computers, and we have our own high-performance servers that we do this sort of work on. But the basic essence of what we're doing here is that instead of being limited by the measurements that we have, which are, good, but in best case scenario, like in Turkey River, only go back about 80 or 90 years, and in many parts of the country are much shorter than that if they exist at all. Let's do this differently. Let's create our own recipes of floods based on what we think is possible given current climate and hydrologic conditions. And so we can create 1 million floods if we want to, of different combinations of rainfall and land cover and soil moisture and snow and all these different factors. And then we can run simulations of these, all these different combinations on these computer systems. And so I'm going to show you just what one of these simulations might look like. So this is a nice rendering from some collaborators of mine at University of Iowa. So this is a watershed here in Iowa. I believe it's I forget. I'm not sure which watershed it is, but this is a rainstorm here. You're going to see it move over the watershed, and then these blue lines that you see are the rivers in that watershed, and so you're going to see them get bluer and thicker, denoting that they're, meaning they're filling up with water, and then you're going to see that flood move downstream. So let's see if we can get this to play. There it goes. So that rainstorm moves over, drops its rain, and the flood then moves down and eventually moves out of the watershed. And so that's, again, the result of a computer simulation, and we run those sorts of things. When I say on a daily basis, what I really should say is, we can run 100,000 of those on a daily basis. And so, I don't get bogged down in this. I'm going to tell you what the main takeaway is. We can run this for sort of long-term historical conditions and then conditions right now and see how the results are different. And so the basic conclusions of this were that these days in Turkey River we see fewer floods that are driven by the sort of moderate amounts of rainfall falling on top of snow, melting that snow, and so then in that case you get a flood that's sort of a combination of rain and melted snow. So we see fewer of those. We see more of these floods that are being driven by wet soils plus extreme rainfall in the summertime. And then the key point here is that what used to be a 100-year flood in Turkey River is now something more like a 20-year flood, so happening roughly 5 times as often as it used to. And that's a pretty big implication when it comes to infrastructure and whatnot. Perhaps fortunately Turkey River doesn't have a whole lot of people and infrastructure in it, but these sorts of changes are taking place in more populated areas as well. And that includes Milwaukee. So here I'm going to tell you that in some ways the story is the same. So in Milwaukee, we're seeing more summertime floods, fewer spring floods. So this map is, so the gray area here is the Milwaukee metropolitan area, and then there are a number of watersheds shown here in the black outlines. We're going to just focus on 2. So Cedar Creek, which is north of the city up here and relatively unurbanized, and then Menominee River, which is, of course, very heavily urbanized. And so here we're actually looking at pretty much the same types of measurements that I mentioned already, so the largest river flow observations from each year. In this case, we've broken them apart into 2 different time periods. So one, basically the early half of the record starting in 1962, and then more recently. And so in that early part of the record, both of these watersheds behave pretty much the same way. Okay, so a lot of these floods happening in February and March, occasionally in the summertime. And then now if you look in the more recent part of the record, Cedar Creek rather, is doing basically the same thing that it used to be in terms of having a lot of these floods happening in the springtime. The Menominee River, though, in Milwaukee has really heavily shifted towards these summertime floods. Okay, so so that's interesting. And we did a little bit of digging into why that might be the case, and what we found was that Milwaukee really is a hot spot for thunderstorms. So this is showing thunderstorm rainfall, in this case blue colors meaning heavier rainfall. And so there's just this bullseye right over the urban area. And then on this side we're showing summertime numbers of cloud-to-ground lightning strikes. So there are actually detection networks that will record every lightning strike across the entire country. And again, you see elevated lightning activity right over the city, indicating high thunderstorm activity. And so this was from back during my PhD days, and so my colleagues then did some additional work to try to figure out what might be explaining that. And again, in this case, they turned to some computer simulations, so using what's called the Weather Research and Forecasting Model. So instead of simulating floods, what they're doing is actually simulating what's going on in the atmosphere, including simulating rainfall. And so in these models, you are able really to play God, I suppose. And so what they did was they ran a number of different simulations. I'm going to emphasize just two of them. One of them they called a control simulation. I'll call this just the real world simulation, where Milwaukee was represented as it really is. And then they ran another simulation where they replaced the urban area by cropland. And so they're calling that the no urban simulation. So I'm going to show you some of those results. And so basically what happened here when they ran those simulations, and they did this for July 2010 storm. Some of you may remember that was a really big one in the Milwaukee area, caused quite a bit of damage. So what they found was that when you removed the urban area in this model for that storm, the rainfall went, the rainfall rate went down from where it is here down to roughly half that amount. And so that's implying that, at least in the model, and probably in reality as well, the urban area is having a really big influence on rainfall in Milwaukee. And so they looked a little deeper into why that might be happening, and so let me just get you oriented for what we're going to see here. So this is Milwaukee here. Of course, we have the lake out east, and what we're going to do is take a side view of this in a moment. So we have this line A to B, and we're just going to rotate that and look, take a side view. So here's the side view. So we have, in this case, in the real world simulation, the city, and then the lake to the east, and then, of course, cropland and the lake in the no urban simulation. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through what's going on here. So that storm, like most storms in this region, in the summertime at least, move from the west to the east. Okay, so that storm moves, encounters the city, which is hot because of this urban heat island, and so that storm starts to heat up. And we know what warm air does, right? It likes to rise. So that warm air rises. We also know that the higher up you get into the atmosphere, the colder it gets. So that air is going to start to cool down, and what that does is going back to the Clausius-Clapeyron Equation, it reduces the capacity for that air to hold its humidity, so it's going to fall out as rain, okay? So warm air rising, rain comes down. The other thing that happens, though, because you have the lake right there, the other thing that happens is that as that warm air is rising, air has to come in and fill that void that's being left by that rising air. Because the lake is there, that air that's moving in is moving in off of the lake, and it's very humid because there's a lot of water obviously there because of the lake, particularly in the summertime when that lake is warm. And so then that humid air coming off the lake moves over the city, it warms up, it rises, it cools, that rain falls out, more humid air is coming off the lake and doing the same thing. And so the basic story here is that the city is actually amplifying the amount of rainfall that you're getting, or actually I should say the interaction of the city with the lake is amplifying. And so this is showing, these arrows are just showing the wind velocities moving from the lake over the city. That's what we call a lake breeze intrusion, and you don't see that at all when the city is removed from the model. Okay, so the basic, well, yeah. So then I'm gonna just spend a few minutes talking about some of the implications of all of this when it comes to thinking about now and in the future. So one point that I'd like to make is that it has been studied a lot. So for example, just around here, we have things like the Lake Level Task Force, City of Madison and some of the other communities are doing a number of flood mapping studies to better understand risks and management strategies. But it's complicated, and I would say that any of the folks that are involved in these would tell you that even just from the science standpoint, there are still some things that we don't really know about and really do need to get a better handle on. I'm not going to talk about what those sort of gaps are. I would rather leave that to the people that are sort of in the trenches on these particular projects, because I don't want to misrepresent them. What I have spent a lot of time on, and I'll just say 30 seconds about it right now, is the fact that I've mentioned things like 10-year storms, 100-year storms. The actual statistics that we're using of 10-year storms, 100-year storms, and everything in between for infrastructure design purposes are roughly 10 years out of date at this point, and we recently published a study showing that throughout much of the country, those statistics are very far behind where they really need to be. And so we're currently trying to update those statistics for the state of Wisconsin. Here you can see, this is what the National Weather Service says the 100-year storm across Wisconsin is in inches over a 24-hour period. This is what the rainy day software says. And if you take the difference between the two, you'll see that particularly for our part of the state, but really throughout much of the state, we're seeing that the National Weather Service estimates are probably really underestimating the severity of these storms. And so that means that any piece of infrastructure that's built based off of this, which is all infrastructure that's built, that's what they're required to use by law, is behind where it needs to be. And so we're trying to get on top of that using some more recent data and computational methods. So, I don't think I need to spend too much time emphasizing this. Urbanization matters. It's really simple. If you go from pre-developed to developed, you're losing a lot of infiltration and gaining a lot of quick runoff. And so, when we look at Dane County, that's certainly a big issue. We've seen, I don't know what the exact number there is, but to my eye, that looks like maybe roughly a doubling in urban areas within the watershed in the past 50 years or so. Are we going to double this again in the next 50? And if so, are we going to be doing what we need to along the way to try to mitigate the consequences of that? One topic that gets talked about a lot when it comes to mitigating those consequences is green infrastructure. And so, there are a number of different measures that get used here and elsewhere, but a lot of it is trying to increase that amount of infiltration and decrease the amount of runoff that you get. And so we need to be doing this. The city is doing it. Others around the state are doing it, and that's good. I'm going to just suggest and this might blow up in my face here, but I'm going to suggest that we need to be careful about how we do this, and I'm going to tell you why I think that's the case. So this is a study from some colleagues of mine, and this was not looking at green infrastructure and not looking at urban areas, but the basic story here was they were looking at how groundwater recharge from increased infiltration related to flooding. And so this is showing the depth to the water table over time, and then this black line is showing in the northern part of the Yahara Watershed the amount of flooded area. And there's a little bit of issue with non-overlapping records and whatnot, but they do coincide very closely, and the water table elevation and inundated area are going up, okay? So, what does this have to do with, what's going on here in Madison, for example? I think it's fairly clear that why this would be the case. This is just schematically showing the deal. So if you have more rainfall, like we're seeing, of course, it's going to just push this water table up. And here, of course, we're showing trees and corn stalks and things like that. But this could be going on in urban areas as well. And so I would say that when we have the big increases in annual rainfall totals that we're seeing, combined with potentially widespread implementation of green infrastructure and measures to increase infiltration, are we going to be seeing more of this sort of stuff? So this is a flooded basement, basically associated with rising water tables. And so I'm not saying that we need to stop all green infrastructure by any means, and I think we should do more than we are now. But at the same time, I think we need to be getting a handle on where the best places to do it are based on soil conditions and based on where the water table is relative to the land surface or relative to where people's basements are and whatnot. And so we're looking for ways right now to try to study that problem and find hopefully some research funding to tackle that. Okay, so just to summarize, recent widespread increases in extreme rainfall, they're due to a number of different things spanning from global down to local issues. Then it gets even more complicated when you start talking about flooding, because you can have all these different recipes, and so we saw that in some ways there are similarities, in some ways big differences between different locations in the surrounding region. And this diversity of local conditions, I think means that the solutions are going to need to vary from place to place as well. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we've got plenty of time for Q&A. Oh, sure.
Can you give us some sense of what data exists on groundwater levels compared to what's on the surface?
Not much is, I think, the basic story. And I will say that I am not really a groundwater guy, and so I don't deal with that sort of data on a regular basis. There would be people that are better qualified to answer that question than me. But I have asked around and to the hydrogeologists at the university and at the USGS, and it sounds like even just in Dane County, there's not nearly as much as we would like. So, sorry, I don't have a better answer to that.
So you had a slide showing that the southwestern portion of the state was going to have more rain than possibly other parts of the state. If you go back a couple.
Yeah.
I've heard rumors that one of the reasons that that part of the state gets more rain is that we can blame it on Iowa because of the amount of corn and the amount of humidity coming off of corn with rain. Is that true or false?
Good question. So I mentioned the urban heat island. People have proposed that there's a corn island. I've not looked into it myself. It's certainly plausible, and I just don't know the answer to it, and I suspect that nobody really does. That's one of those things where it's going to be really hard to understand using only measurements, just because we don't really have. You might be surprised to hear we don't have measurement systems built to measure the Corn Island, and so then people turn to things like these computer models, and those computer models, allow us to do a lot of really nice things, but you have to take it all with a bit of a grain of salt as well. And so I'm not ready to answer true or false to that one. None of the above, maybe both.
Yeah, it looked like the Atlas 14 took the 100-year rainfall. It used to be 6 inches in 24 hours. It took it to 6.66 inches in 24 hours. It sounds like your research has suggested that it's higher than that. Do you have a number, how much higher it is? And then the other question I have is, why was the analysis period for the rainy day only from 2002 to 2019? Why wasn't it from 1900 to 2019?
Yeah, good question. So I glossed over that part here. So to your first question, my sense is that the 100-year rainfall is right now about 8 inches for Madison, which is quite a bit higher than 6.6. That's coming partly from rainy day and partly from independent analysis that I've done using long-term rain gauge observations as well. And both of those tell you a similar story. So to your second question, I didn't point this out, but here we're saying the analysis period is roughly 1900 to 2012. I say roughly because this is using rain gauge measurements scattered all throughout the state. Some of them have short records, some of them have very long records, some of them maybe even earlier than 1900 start dates. And rainy day, we're using a much shorter time period. This shorter time period comes from the fact that rainy day is using weather radar measurements, which only go back to 2002. So, when I tell some people that, they say, well, that's a problem because, you're trying to say things like about the 100-year storm from short records. Well, one answer to that I'm not going to get into because I don't have time and I didn't give you a background on how the software works. But the answer that I think is more relevant to your question is the rainfall has changed dramatically over the past century, and in particular in the last few decades. And so if you're running analyses using really old observations, that's good in the sense that you have a lot of data to work with. But those old data don't really seem to be representing what's going on now, and certainly not what's going to likely be going on in the future. Whereas with our analysis period, because it's much shorter, it's focused more heavily on this time period of recent memory where we have been seeing this much greater incidence of heavy rainstorms. And so you could argue that in this case, using shorter time periods actually is advantageous.
Hi, Daniel. John McIntyre with the AmFam Institute. We do investments in startups and resiliency. You mentioned one concern. They're doing geospatial mapping in Japan. I think they're doing it here in the U.S. as well. Are you working very closely with them? And I'm just curious if you can give us a little more insight into that.
Yeah, so this has only been underway for a couple of months, and they have a lot of great folks there, really talented, and so they're really grabbing this and running with it. And so my involvement is just really an advisory role, giving them tips on ins and outs of how the software works and how they might think about running it most efficiently with the data that they have available for Japan. They're starting with Japan. Well, I don't know, sort of the business side of it, but they're beginning there with the plan of doing similar work here in the U.S. The U.S. is a complicated place when it comes to flood risk and flood insurance, which is really their interest amongst other types of natural disasters, because we do have this federal flood insurance program that is taxpayer subsidized, which makes it really difficult for private companies like One Concern and others to break into that line of business.
Our last question.
Yeah, Dr. Wright, if you would mind going back to that slide where you showed the heat island effect along with the water coming back from the lake.
This one?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
we've all heard about the kind of lake effect on snow in Chicago and Milwaukee and urban areas that are right next to a big lake. But this is the first time I've heard the urban heat island effect combined with next to a lake. So is this the same type of thing that happened in Houston with the hurricane, what was that, Ivan, I think?
Harvey, yeah.
Harvey, and then also I'm thinking about the tropical storm Sandy on the East Coast, where you have a lot of developed urban areas. So I would think snow would apply. You have hotter temperatures than we normally have in the winter over the last 10 years. Can it be applied to other areas? And is it also happening with snowstorms as well in the winter?
Yeah, so good question. So regarding the snow, I'm not sure. I really just don't know. When it comes to talking about other locations, people are looking at this. So I know that there are studies, for example, looking at similar phenomena for Shanghai, for example, and they're showing some similar sorts of results. Plenty of other coastal areas that would be interesting to apply it to, look at similar effects. Oops, sorry about that. So I suspect that this is going on in other places as well, and we're going to see more folks looking into this sort of thing. When it comes to hurricanes and tropical storms, I would actually guess that this effect would be less important, and the reason for that is these storms are so big, they have essentially a life of their own, that they're going to be feeling the effects of the city less than sort of a smaller thunderstorm might. That said, I think that there's some work coming out now that's showing at least minor impacts of the urban area on Hurricane Harvey, for example, again, using kind of similar modeling types of approaches. But I think less dramatic sort of changes than we found for this particular storm in Milwaukee.
All right, that's all the time we have this morning. I want to thank Dr. Wright one more time for that couple of quick announcements real quick. Next month, April 15th, we'll be back here for a special event, not actually Yahara Lakes 101, but we'll have sort of a similar, a little bit of a different format. We're going to have a real large event on what you can do at home maybe to help mitigate some of these issues in our Resilient Landscape event. So don't miss that, April 15th, right here at the Edgewater. Our breakfast, our community breakfast is coming up on May 14th. That's at the Alliant Energy Center. If you haven't bought tickets, you can still go on to cleanlakesalliance.org and get that. We'll have a host of scientists and government officials and community leaders talking about where we are with the lakes. Our bike ride, June 20th, sign up for that. It's super fun, goes around Lake Monona, starts and ends at Olbert Park. And then we have our big, if anybody wants to swim 1.2 or 2.4 miles, you've always wanted to do it, our big swell swim is June 6th. So thank you very much. And if you haven't got a parking voucher, be sure to grab one on your way out. Thanks.